So, school climate really does improve the lives of young people. When you have a positive climate, you're creating an environment that is conducive to learning and physically safe. I'll mention just a teeny bit about Sandy Hook, but physically safe, emotionally safe, intellectually safe. It's really important that we focus on all aspects of safety. Okay, let's look at school climate and what we might call dimensions. I don't want to be confusing to people. There are 5 school climate standards, which we'll get to, but the standards and the work of school climate is all about honoring some very important dimensions. The first dimension is safety. When we're talking about talking about school climate, and remember, you can have a negative school climate as well as a positive school climate. School climate's a negative term here. I mean, a neutral term. It's a neutral term. So when you're looking at the dimension of safety, you could have an unsafe environment in many, many different ways. But when you're looking at the dimensions of safety, it's about physical safety, emotional safety, intellectual safety, and the rules and norms that establish the parameters for all of that. So that's one dimension of climate. Another dimension has to do with interpersonal relationships, how people treat one another. And this is a respect for diversity, making sure this is about equality. It's about equity, making sure everybody is included and honored and receives a high-quality education and so on. It's about diversity, and it's about social support, not just for students, but for adults. It's about professional relationships and having that connection with the school, as well as making sure that the supports that are needed to do that are available. And let me just put out here something, those of you who've heard me say it, it's not as radical for those of you who haven't heard me say it, and that is that the work of creating a positive school climate is adult work. Students and what students do and how they act is really a reflection of the adults and how they structure the environment, the climate. The question has to do with, would I speak a little bit, I'm doing this because it's being videotaped, would I speak a little bit more about the importance of strong bonds to school? I will tell you that being a part of a school and being connected to school is an absolutely key element, and it's adults as well as students. And part of the resources that we have that we're going to show you later is around what is known as school connectedness. And school connectedness, it's not up here, but I'll tell you very quickly, is about being close to people at school. It's not just peer-to-peer, it's importantly adults to students. And in fact, one of the most important strategies that any of you can do if you're talking about what do I do next is to ensure that, or work toward, let me say it that way, work toward every single student in school having a meaningful connection with an adult. That is probably more important than anything else you can do, in addition to role modeling and being a good stellar example of how you treat others. But when you look at connectedness, being close to people at school, being happy to be at school, which is no small thing. My colleague Stan Davis writes about schools being joyful places, but that has to be a joyful place for adults as well as for young people. And then feeling a part of the school is another measure of connectedness, feeling as though you're treated fairly, and finally feeling safe. So those bonds are absolutely critical. And when you don't have those kind of bonds for adults, not only do you have disgruntled and unsatisfied adults who are then projecting that for kids, but you have great teacher turnover rate. And those kinds of changes for young people matter and make a huge difference in their ability to learn. So I could keep going on that one, but at least I'll say that much so far. Okay. Now notice the third dimension of climate here is about teaching and learning, and making sure that we remove the barriers to learning for young people. We talk so often about children having an achievement, or we have a huge achievement gap in this state. I think it's more accurately described as an opportunity gap. And that notion that we need to provide opportunities for those who don't have them is probably a better thought process and strategy and goal than trying to close some kind of achievement gap. It just doesn't make sense. And that's, again, language that's being used nationally. It's not just a fly-by-night kind of way of looking at this. But teaching and learning, supports for learning, and making sure that learning includes social, emotional, and civic learning. Why? Because we ought to be raising people who can be good citizens, not just those who can fill out bubbles on a test sheet. And it's important that we don't lose sight of our goals, of raising good people who can be lifelong learners and so on. And in a staff arena, and this is my colleague Darlene Faster, I haven't seen Darlene yet, but she's coming from the National School Climate Center. We'll be talking in one of the breakouts about assessing climate through that honors all these dimensions. And when you survey staff, faculty and staff, there are questions about leadership, and that's an important dimension of climate when you're looking through the lenses of all these pieces. And finally, that external environment. And here's where we get what I mentioned before, connectedness or engagement, but also the physical surroundings. The very things that we're talking about in terms of, in the context of Sandy Hook, yes, that's part of climate. And in fact, in buildings that are older and don't have a chance of renovation, making them warm and inviting, putting up student work, painting hallways, murals, all of that kind of things make a school feel safer and more welcoming, and these dimensions all link together. So these are the dimensions of climate. It's not something after you do academics. It's not something after you worry about security. These are the dimensions that are part and define what school climate is. Okay.